what made decision making so interesting to you?
Well, for me, it's always been the most fascinating aspect of psychology. I think it's in some way the essence of what makes us human, that we have to make decisions. We have to decide our courses of action, and these can be very trivial decisions as to what we have for lunch, or more important decisions like, do we engage in a podcast?
Right.
Or really serious decisions, do we buy a house? Do we get married? What job do we take? And of all the different facets of psychology, this was the one that kind of resonated with me immediately once I started studying psychology way back as an undergraduate, because this seemed to encompass all of those other aspects, memory, cognition, language, perception. All of those seem to really boil down to and be distilled to how we make decisions and choices. And one thing that always struck me was that we didn't really know that much about it. So there was a lot of research in different fields. So for example, economics, some in neuroscience, but the psychology of decision making was rather limited, and limited to a particular type of studies, which were these studies by Kahneman and Tversky. People probably know Danny Kahneman as a Nobel Prize winner and an author of Thinking Fast and Slow, which is one of the most, I think, successful popular science books. And Danny Kahneman with Amos Tversky led a very influential research program which tried to understand decision making, but which tried to understand it from the perspective of when it goes wrong. And so they had wonderful, vivid examples of people making kind of, quote, irrational decisions, which are tremendously entertaining, and it's really nice to see these examples, which are a little bit equivalent to looking at perceptual illusions when you're trying to study vision. So you look at where the system kind of breaks down.
It tells you something about the system, right?
It does indeed, and of course it's very informative, but I always felt it was a little bit limited in that there's a wide variety of cases where there either isn't a rational or irrational response, there isn't an optimal solution, and that most of the time we actually do pretty well with our decisions, right? We successfully navigate the world to the most part. We've all arrived here thanks to careful decision making by our generations of ancestors. So we must be doing something right. So I became interested in studying decision making, but not just from the kind of where it fails part. And so could we kind of better understand how we make decisions without necessarily the judgment of whether they're good or bad, but just understand the process by which we arrive at choices in everyday life.
And that has then led you from the more studies that were more focused on figuring out when does it break down, more into the neuroscience aspects of it?
Yeah, that was the trajectory. So initially my PhD was in cognitive psychology, and there we were inspired by many of these Kahneman and Tversky studies to look at how memory plays a role in decision making, and how memory sometimes helps and sometimes hinders our decision making depending on the accuracy of our memories. This was back in the late 90s, and so the study of neuroscience was really starting to come into psychology then. So the availability of things like fMRI brain imaging started to be available to psychologists, and that just seemed to me really interesting development because one, I think, downside of the psychological models is that they were largely a black box where the brain was, and it's like some magic happens here, and the decision is output. But it wasn't very clear what kind of processes actually went on to arrive at the decision. And neuroscience and fMRI in particular seem to offer a way of constraining our models by the biology. And so I had an opportunity to do some fMRI studies as a final year PhD student. And that really, I think, set me on a path of trying to integrate the psychological and neuroscientific aspects to build these models.